Before we begin, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Are you curled up at home, sneaking this in during your lunch break, or somewhere halfway across the world? We love knowing where our readers are. And if you're a fan of slow burn romance, dangerous men, and women who absolutely refuse to be intimidated, you are in exactly the right place. This one is going to keep you up all night. Let's go. The rain in Chicago had been falling since Sunday, the kind of grey, relentless drizzle that seeped into brick and bone alike and made the whole city smell like wet asphalt and old ambition. Elena Vasquez had learned in her 26 years of living that Chicago rain didn't care about your schedule. It didn't care that you had an interview at 9, that you'd spent 45 minutes on your hair, or that your umbrella, the third one this year, had chosen this particular Tuesday morning to collapse in on itself like a small metal tragedy. She stood at the corner of a Michigan Avenue and Erie Street, holding the twisted wire carcass of the umbrella above her head in a gesture of pure denial, and watched the L train pull away from the elevated platform 2 blocks east. "Perfect," she said to no one in particular. "Absolutely perfect." A woman in a yellow slicker shot her a sympathetic look as she passed. A cab blew through a puddle and sent a fan of brown water arcing over the sidewalk, missing Eleanor's shoes by roughly 3 inches. She took it as a win. She ducked under the green awning of a coffee shop she'd never been inside, Murano's according to the brass lettering above the door, and pulled out her phone to check the damage. She had 40 minutes before her interview at Hartley and Associates, the accounting firm on Wacker Drive that was, at this precise moment, her last viable job prospect in the city. Her savings account had exactly 11 days left in it. Her landlord had begun leaving passive-aggressive notes under her door, and her mother had called 3 times last week to ask if she'd considered moving back to Tucson. Eleanor had not considered moving back to Tucson. She smoothed her blazer, checked her reflection in the dark screen of her phone, hair damp at the temples, mascara stubbornly intact, expression determined, and pushed open the door of Murano's. The coffee shop was warm in the way that only old buildings could be warm, radiating from brick walls and the hiss of a proper espresso machine behind the bar. It smelled extraordinary, dark roast and sweet almond paste and something buttery baking in a back kitchen. The floor was black and white checkerboard tile worn smooth in the paths between tables. Old photographs lined the walls, a Naples harbor, Mount Vesuvius, men in suspenders laughing around a table loaded with food. Elena went to the counter, ordered a small coffee. She was watching the budget even in emergencies, and found a stool at the window bar, setting her ruined umbrella beside her like a patient that wasn't going to make it. She spent 10 minutes reviewing her interview notes. She was good at numbers. She was meticulous, reliable, and she'd spent 2 years at a mid-sized firm in Phoenix before the firm had been absorbed by a larger one that had laid off half its staff in a single Friday afternoon email. She had a clean resume, solid references, and a genuine enthusiasm for tax code that she'd learned to keep carefully concealed during the first 5 minutes of any social interaction. She would get this job. She was rehearsing an answer to, "Where do you see yourself in 5 years?" when the door of the coffee shop opened and 3 men walked in. She noticed them the way you notice weather changing, a pressure shift, a sudden stillness. The other customers noticed too. 2 women at the corner table stopped talking mid-sentence. The barista behind the counter straightens slightly, the way people do when they're trying to look casual and failing. The first two men were large in the specific way that suggested they were paid to be large. Dark coats, hands loose at their sides, eyes that moved around the room like searchlights before their bodies fully cleared the doorway. The third man was different. He was tall, 6'2", maybe more, with the kind of build that was lean rather than bulky, though nothing about him suggested softness. His coat was charcoal wool, cut precisely, and he wore it with the ease of someone who'd never in his life wondered whether he could afford something. His hair was dark, slightly longer on top, and the rain had caught it just enough to make it curl slightly at the temples. His jaw was sharp. His mouth was a firm, unsmiling line. His eyes, when they moved across the room, were the colour of smoke, grey shading toward green, and they catalogued everything they touched with an efficiency that felt almost mechanical. Those eyes landed on Elena for approximately 1 second. She looked back out of the window. She did not look back. She was good at not looking back at things she shouldn't look at. It was a skill she'd cultivated. She heard them settle into the large corner booth. The one she'd noticed was conspicuously empty, even when the rest of the shop was fairly full. Reserved, she assumed, or simply understood to be reserved. She drank her coffee. She reviewed her notes. She listened, without meaning to the low murmur of Italian from the corner, too rapid and too quiet to pass, even if she'd spoken the language, which she did not beyond coffee orders and swear words. She was reaching for her bag, calculating whether she had time to walk to the Wacker Drive office if she left now, when she knocked the ruined umbrella off its perch against the window bar. It clattered to the floor with the specific loud, wire-springing crash of an object that has nothing left to lose, slid 2 feet across the checkerboard tile, and came to rest precisely at the feet of the large man who had materialized beside her table. Not one of the large men from the door. The third man. The one with the smoke-grey eyes. He looked down at the umbrella. He looked up at her. "I'm so sorry," Elena said, and slid off the stool to retrieve it. He crouched at the same moment she did, and for a second they were at the same level, 6 inches apart. And she had a close-range view of a face that was even more precisely structured than she'd registered from a distance. A small scar bisected his left eyebrow, old, silvered, barely visible unless you were exactly this close. He smelled like cedar and rain and something darker underneath. He picked up the umbrella. She reached for it. Their fingers overlapped on the wire handle. "It's broken," he said. His accent was subtle, American flattened, mostly, but with Italian vowels rounding the edges of certain words. Broken. The O was almost musical. "I know," Elena said. "I've been in denial about it." He looked at her, not the quick catalogue sweep she'd caught earlier, but something more direct, more curious, as if she'd said something unexpected. "Thank you," she said, taking the umbrella from his hand. She straightened. He straightened. She was 5'5". He was considerably more than that. "Sorry for the disruption." "It's nothing," he said, and then, rather than going back to his booth, he stood there for a moment, just a fraction of a moment, the kind that's too short to be awkward but long enough to register, looking at her with that precise, assessing gaze. "Good luck," he said. He glanced at her phone where her interview notes were still open on the screen, and then he went back to his booth. Elena stood holding her broken umbrella, her heart doing something it had absolutely no business doing, and made herself count to 5 before she picked up her bag, tucked the umbrella under her arm, and walked out of Morano's into the rain. She did not look back at the corner booth. Almost. She got the interview wrong in the way that sometimes happens when your mind is in two places at once. Technically competent, warm in the right moments, but slightly off tempo, as if she were translating a half-second behind herself. Mr. Hartley, a pleasant man with reading glasses perpetually pushed up onto his forehead, thanked her and said they'd be in touch. She knew what "will be in touch" meant. She walked home through rain that had finally softened to mist, past the familiar storefronts of her Wicker Park neighborhood, up the 3 flights to her apartment that smelled like old wood, and her neighbor, Mrs. Petrakis's cooking, and sat on her kitchen counter with a glass of red wine she absolutely could not afford, and stared at her phone. She Googled Morano's coffee. The results were thin. A basic listing. 4-star average with 14 reviews, all of them noting the excellent espresso and the authentic atmosphere. No website, no social media presence, opened in 1987. She clicked on the street view and looked at the green awning. She closed the app. She was not going to think about a man with a broken umbrella excuse and a scarred eyebrow, and eyes like overcast weather. She had 11 days of savings and 0 job offers, and a mother in Tucson waiting to say "I told you so" in the kindest possible voice. She went to bed. She thought about him anyway. His name was Matteo Conti, and he had not thought about a woman in any personal sense for approximately 3 years. This was not unusual for men in his position, which was a position that consumed everything it touched: time, attention, loyalty, warmth. The organization, the Conti family as it was known in certain rooms in Chicago and New York and Naples, had been his inheritance since the age of 22, when his father had been killed in a dispute with the Marchetti family from the South Side. Matteo had spent the following 4 years restructuring, consolidating, and making it abundantly clear to anyone who required clarity that the dispute was settled, had always been settled, and the Contis' dominance over the northern half of Chicago's underworld operations was a permanent geographic feature, like Lake Michigan. He was 34 now. He ran a legitimate import business, 3 restaurants, a real estate development firm, and a private security company, all of which were exactly as legitimate as they needed to be for the purposes of bank paperwork. He sat on 2 charitable foundation boards. He had a townhouse in Lincoln Park, and a house in Lake Forest, and an apartment in Naples that he visited twice a year and thought of as home in the abstract, sentimental way of people who have not allowed themselves a home in a long time. He was, by any measure, a successful man. He was also, by any honest accounting, a profoundly isolated one. He had not thought about this isolation as a rule. Matteo Conti did not spend significant time examining his interior landscape. He had spent his entire adult life being ruthlessly external, reading rooms, reading people, calculating vectors of power and weakness and leverage with a precision that had kept him alive and kept his family intact through challenges that had destroyed lesser organizations. He was excellent at people as problems. He was not, currently, excellent at people as people. And yet, he sat in the corner booth of Morano's, his grandfather's coffee shop, unchanged since 1987, the one place in Chicago where he could sit for an hour without anyone requiring anything of him, and found himself thinking about a woman with dark hair and a broken umbrella, who had looked directly at him without flinching. This happened less than you might think. Most people, when they found themselves close to Matteo Conti, either adjusted their expression into careful neutrality, the ones who knew who he was, or felt the ambient weight of him and looked away, the ones who didn't, but whose instincts were working correctly. Occasionally someone tried to perform friendliness, which was its own kind of looking away. She had just looked at him directly, without adjustment, without a flicker of the calculation he was accustomed to seeing in people's eyes when they realized who they were dealing with. She hadn't known who he was. That was the obvious explanation. He turned his attention back to Ricci, who had been talking for the past 3 minutes about the Ferrano family's encroachment on their distribution network in the western suburbs, and filed the woman with the umbrella in a folder in his mind labeled irrelevant, and closed it. "The Ferrano situation," he said, "needs to be handled before the end of the month. And the other matter." The other matter was, in fact, the more pressing issue, though it was not the kind of thing Matteo preferred to discuss in any location, however secure. His grandmother had been unwell for 6 months. Caterina Conti, 81 years old, the matriarch of the family in every sense that counted, had been declining since the winter, in a way that her doctors described with careful optimism, and Matteo translated, because he was fluent in careful optimism, as she is running out of time. She had asked him for one thing, one single thing, in 40 years of asking very little of him. She wanted him married before she died. This was not a romantic request. Caterina Conti was not a romantic woman. She was a practical one in the way of women who have survived the specific practicalities of life in a mafia family for 60 years. She wanted the line of succession clear. She wanted the family stable. She wanted, above all, to see the Conti name continue through something other than violence and business. She wanted a grandson who came home to someone. Matteo had spent 3 months trying to reason with her, which was approximately 3 months longer than he'd ever spent trying to reason with anyone about anything. Caterina was immovable. She had revised her position not at all. She had simply looked at him with those ancient, very clear dark eyes and said, "Matteo, I am not asking you to love someone. I am asking you not to die alone," which had struck him, in the privacy of his own mind, rather harder than he'd expected. The problem was the practical one. He could not marry within the usual circles. The women available to him in those circles, daughters of allied families, women who understood the world they were marrying into, carried with them political implications that were, at this particular moment, impossible. The Marchetti family had a daughter. So did the Benedetti family in New York. Either alliance would enrage the other, and he was already navigating enough tensions without adding a matrimonial power play. He needed someone from outside, someone with no political implications whatsoever, someone who could perform the role for a period, long enough to satisfy his grandmother, to provide the stable image the family needed while he managed the current transitions, and then dissolve from it cleanly. A contract, in other words, a professional arrangement. Ricci had been handling the preliminary search for candidates. 3 so far, a graduate student who'd been too curious about the organization's actual business, a woman from the suburbs who'd agreed too eagerly, which worried him, and a third who had simply never shown up to the preliminary meeting, which was its own answer. "Not yet," Matteo said to Ricci's question about the other matter. He picked up his espresso. In the window across the room, the green awning dripped rain onto the empty stool where a woman with a broken umbrella had been sitting 40 minutes ago. He drank his coffee, filed her again under irrelevant. The folder didn't stay closed as neatly as he would have liked. On the 8th day of her 11-day window, Elena got a second interview, not at Hartley and Associates, at a small private firm she'd applied to through a contact of a contact, Meridian Capital, a financial consulting group that operated out of a Streeterville high-rise and specialized, apparently, in high-net-worth individual clients. The email was formal and brief, offering her a Thursday appointment at 2 o'clock, and Elena had spent 20 minutes reading it over, looking for the catch before deciding there wasn't one and confirming. She celebrated with a can of soup and a call to her friend Diane, who was a paralegal downtown and the most sensible person Elena knew. "Don't get excited," Diane said, which was what Diane always said, and which Elena always found bracing rather than discouraging. But also exciting. "I know, I'm trying to calibrate." "How'd the Hartley one go?" "I was distracted." "By what?" Elena paused. "Nothing, never mind." Diane had the specific silence of someone who had known Eleanor for 8 years and was choosing strategically not to press. "Wear the navy blazer Thursday," she said instead. "You look competent in the navy blazer." Eleanor wore the navy blazer. Meridian Capital occupied the 42nd floor, and the receptionist who greeted her was so polished she seemed almost decorative. Elena was shown to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake, silver grey today matching the sky, and left with a glass of water and the kind of comfortable chair that costs more than her monthly rent. The man who came in after 10 minutes was not what she'd expected. Mid-50s, Italian-American with reading glasses and the comfortable air of someone who hadn't needed to prove anything to anyone for a very long time. He introduced himself as Frank Ricci and explained that Meridian handled complex financial arrangements for clients who valued discretion above all else. Elena nodded. She'd done her research on the firm. It was legitimate, she'd checked, because she checked everything. SEC registered, clean record. The client list wasn't public, but the firm's reputation was sound. The interview was unusual from the start. Ricci asked her standard questions, her background, her experience with confidentiality agreements, her comfort with unconventional arrangements. He seemed less interested in her accounting skills specifically than in her character, how she handled pressure, what she did when she disagreed with a situation, whether she had family locally. She answered honestly. She was good at honest. At the end, he slid a piece of paper across the table. "Before I explain the full position," he said, "I need you to sign this NDA. If you'd prefer not to, there's no obligation. We'll call it an informational interview and leave it there." Elena read the NDA carefully. It was standard in form, but sweeping in scope. Confidentiality about clients, about the nature of work discussed, about the identity of individuals she might interact with in the course of any potential engagement. She was not to discuss the contents of any offer or arrangement with anyone outside of parties specified by Meridian. She looked up. "This is more comprehensive than most employment NDAs." "The position is more comprehensive than most employment," Ricci said pleasantly. Elena looked at the NDA again, signed it. Ricci folded his hands on the table. He had the manner of a man about to explain something that was going to sound more complicated than it actually was. "The position," he said, is not a standard employment arrangement. It's a contract engagement. Defined term, specific role, significant compensation. The client is a private individual, a businessman of considerable means, who requires, for personal and professional reasons I'll explain in more detail at a subsequent meeting, a woman willing to enter into a temporary marriage arrangement. Elena set her water glass down very carefully. "I'm sorry," she said. "A what arrangement?" "A marriage," Richie said, "on paper. And in public appearances, which would be required approximately 2 to 3 times per week. The arrangement would last a minimum of 6 months, with the possibility of extension. It would conclude with an agreed-upon divorce filing handled by our legal team at no cost to you. Compensation is—" He slid a second piece of paper across the table. Elena looked at the number. She looked at Ricci. She looked at the number again. "That's—" she started. "Per month," Ricci confirmed, "for the duration of the contract." Elena sat back in her chair and looked out at Lake Michigan for a long moment. The number on the page was more than she'd made in any single year of her working life. For 6 months of it, she could pay off her student loans, her credit card, her mother's medical bills from last spring, and still have enough left to start over somewhere with breathing room. "Who is this person?" she said. "That information is provided at the next meeting, which would be with the client himself. At that point, you're free to decline with no further obligation. But we need to know, before we arrange that meeting, whether the concept is one you'd consider." Elena looked at the number 1 more time. "I'd like to think about it," she said. "Of course, we'd need your answer by Friday." She went home. She sat on her kitchen counter with a glass of water. She'd graduated off the wine, which was either virtue or denial, and stared at the wall. She called Diane. "I need to tell you something under hypothetical conditions," she said. "I hate hypotheticals," Diane said. "Tell me the real thing." "I can't. NDA. A long pause. "Elena?" "Hypothetically," Elena said, "if someone offered you an enormous amount of money to be fake married to a person you'd never met for 6 months, and it was legal, and at the end you got a clean divorce and walked away—" "How enormous?" Elena told her the number. Diane was quiet for 4 full seconds. "Is this a crime thing?" Diane said. "They're a registered financial firm. I checked. That is not an answer to my question." "I know." Another silence. "Do you need the money?" "You know I need the money." "Elena." Diane's voice was careful. "You know I trust your judgment. I also know that you are the most stubbornly rational person I've ever met, which means you wouldn't be calling me if you hadn't already decided to say yes." Elena opened her mouth, closed it. "Meet the guy first," Diane said. "And if anything feels wrong, anything, you walk. Promise me." "I promise," Elena said. She emailed Ricci at 8 o'clock that evening. "I'm interested in the next meeting." She hit send before she could think about it any more than she already had. The address Ricci gave her was a townhouse on Burling Street, in the kind of Lincoln Park block that communicated wealth without announcing it. The brick was old, the windows were tall, the iron fencing was ornamental but substantial, and there were no fewer than 2 men in dark coats visible from the street, who were not, Elena was fairly certain, gardeners. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, her navy blazer back in service, and had a brief, clear-eyed conversation with herself. "You can leave," she told herself. "I know," she answered. "This is unusual." "Yes. You're going in anyway," Obviously. She rang the bell. The man who answered was young, mid-twenties, dark-haired, with an expression that was trying to be neutral and landing slightly north of suspicious. He introduced himself as Marco and led her through a foyer that was all dark wood and old marble, and a single enormous oil painting of a Mediterranean coastline, up a staircase, and into a sitting room on the second floor. "Wait here, please," Marco said, and disappeared. Eleanor sat in a chair that was, like the one at Meridian Capital, aggressively comfortable, and looked around the room. It was neither ostentatious nor spare. The furniture was quality, real quality, the kind with histories, and the books on the shelves were actual books, not decorative. She could see the worn spines. Someone read here. There was a desk against the far wall with papers on it, a pen laid across an open notebook, the minor evidence of a life actually being lived in this space. The papers, she noticed without meaning to, were in two columns, one in Italian, one in what looked like figures and dates. She stopped looking at the papers. She heard footsteps in the hall. The door opened, and Matteo Conti walked in. Elena's brain did several things simultaneously. It processed the recognition, the coffee shop, Tuesday, the umbrella, with a lurch that she immediately suppressed, because suppressing lurches was a skill she'd developed over 26 years of being Eleanor Vasquez. It processed the context. So this is who he is. This is what Richie meant by businessman of considerable means, with the rapid, almost algorithmic reassessment that she was good at. And underneath both of those, it processed the same thing it had processed in Morano's, which was the simple, inconvenient fact that he was extraordinarily striking, and that the grey eyes she remembered had fixed on her with the exact same precision as before, and had done in the space of half a second the thing where they registered her without flinching. "You," he said. It wasn't quite an accusation. It wasn't quite anything. "The umbrella," she said, because apparently that was what she had to offer. Something shifted in his expression. Not softened exactly, but recalibrated. He crossed the room, sat in the chair across from her, and looked at her for a long moment in a way that would have been unsettling from most people. From him, it was simply direct. "Ricci told me your name is Eleanor Vasquez," he said. "It is. You're an accountant. I'm a financial analyst, technically. The distinction matters to me more than it does to most people." He almost did something with his mouth. "You grew up in Tucson." Ricci was thorough. "He's paid to be thorough. You've lived in Chicago for 4 years. You went to Arizona State. You worked for Kellerman Group in Phoenix until their reorganization." He said all of this the way she might have read figures from a spreadsheet, informational, without judgment. "You don't have family in Chicago." "Correct." "No serious relationship in the last 2 years." That one landed slightly differently. Elena held his gaze. "Also correct. Though I'm curious how he confirmed that." "Social media and inference," Matteo said. "Nothing invasive. We have limits." "We," Elena noticed, not he. "You know who I am," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I know your name is Matteo Conti, and that you own a number of businesses, and that you're apparently the kind of person who has people background checked before coffee meetings." She paused. "I also know you picked up my umbrella for me, which I'm choosing to count in your favor." He looked at her. That recalibration again. She was beginning to recognize it. the fractional pause when something didn't match his model. "Let me be direct," he said. "Please. My grandmother is dying. She wants to see me married. There are reasons I cannot marry within my own circles at this time. Political reasons, which you don't need to understand in detail. I need a woman who can perform the role of my wife in public, at family events, and in situations where maintaining the appearance of a stable marriage serves my interests. The arrangement would last 6 months, possibly 9. At the end, we file for divorce on grounds of irreconcilable differences. You receive the full amount per the contract. During the arrangement, you live here. This townhouse is yours to occupy, with your own suite of rooms. You have spending allowance for appropriate clothing and expenses. You are not required to perform any role beyond what is visible in public." He said all of this in the same precise, even tone he'd have used to explain a business merger. "What are the political reasons?" she said. "I told you. I know you said I don't need to understand them in detail, but I'd like to understand them in general." Another pause, longer this time. "I run a family organization," he said. "Certain families expect an alliance through marriage. If I marry one, I insult the others. If I marry someone with no connection to those families, I remove myself from the equation." A family organization. Elena was not naive. She had grown up in Tucson, not on the moon. She had seen enough news, read enough, and, moreover, she was an accountant by training, and accountants had a specific relationship with what numbers didn't say, with what went unlisted on balance sheets. She understood what she was being invited into, in the broad, unilluminated outline of it. "You're not a gardener," she said. He blinked. It was the first genuine surprise she'd seen on his face. "No," he said, "I'm not. And Meridian Capital is how your legal business channels things. You're not supposed to be that fast." "You hired someone based on their financial acuity," Elena said, and then seemed surprised when she applied it. He looked at her for a long moment. The grey eyes were doing the thing she'd noticed in the coffee shop, not cataloguing exactly, something closer to attention. Genuine, considered attention. "You understand what this organization is," he said carefully. "I have a reasonable inference. And you're still here." "I'm still here," Elena agreed. "But I have questions." "Of course you do. Is anyone going to get hurt?" He frowned. "What? In connection with this arrangement, the family things you're managing, whatever the political situation is that requires a wife? Is anyone going to get hurt in a way that makes me complicit in something I can't live with?" Matteo Conti stared at her. In 15 years of conducting negotiations, in hundreds of conversations with people who were afraid of him or wanted something from him or both, he could count on one hand the number of times someone had asked him a question that stopped him cold. "No," he said slowly. "Not in any way that touches you. That's not quite the same as no." "No," he said, more deliberate. "The arrangement is purely about appearances. No one is harmed by a marriage." Eleanor held his gaze for another moment. Then she looked out the window, at the iron fence and the street beyond it, at the ordinary afternoon city going about its Tuesday business. "I have more questions," she said. "I know. You're not annoyed by that. I'm—" He stopped, started again. "No, ask them." So she did. She asked for 2 hours. About the contract specifics, about the living arrangements, about the degree of public performance expected, about whether she'd need to meet his family immediately and what she was supposed to say, about how they'd met, about what happened if she disagreed with something he asked her to do, about the exit conditions, about what the divorce would look like on paper, about whether there was a legal team she could independently consult. He answered every question, some of them quickly, some of them after a pause that told her he was thinking rather than deflecting. He called Ricci in for two of the specifics, contract terms she wanted clarified. He did not once tell her she was asking too much or too many things or that she should simply trust him. By the end of the second hour, the light had shifted, going gold and low through the tall windows. "I have one more question," Elena said. "What?" "Why me? Ricci interviewed other candidates. What made you—" She gestured vaguely. Matteo was quiet for a moment. "The others were wrong, for various reasons," he said finally. "That's not an answer to my question." "No," he agreed. He seemed to be deciding something. "You looked at me in the coffee shop like I was a person." Elena waited. "Most people don't," he said simply, and his tone made it purely factual, without any bid for sympathy. "I thought it might be useful for the purposes of a convincing marriage to have a partner who could look at me like that in front of my grandmother." Eleanor thought about this. "All right," she said. He looked up. "All right, what?" "All right, I'll do it." She held out her hand. "But I want the contract reviewed by my own lawyer before I sign. And I reserve the right to renegotiate terms in writing if conditions change materially." He looked at her outstretched hand. He looked at her face. He took her hand. His grip was firm and brief and warm, and Eleanor filed that detail too, in a folder she did not immediately name. "Marco will show you the suite," he said, standing. "You can move in over the weekend if that suits." "Monday," Elena said. "I have things to settle first." "Monday," he agreed. She left. Walking down Burling Street in the gold afternoon light, she called Diane. "I met him," she said. "And?" Diane said. "And I said yes." A long silence. "Elena." "I know. Tell me something." "What?" "Is he awful?" Elena thought about grey eyes and 2 hours of answered questions, and most people don't. "No," she said. "That's sort of the problem." She moved in on Monday with 2 suitcases and a box of books, which Marco seemed to consider a confusing quantity of possessions for someone entering into a high-end arrangement with his employer. He carried the book box with the expression of someone who'd expected designer luggage and had received instead a second-hand paperback of Anna Karenina with margin notes in blue pen. The suite was on the 3rd floor, a bedroom, a sitting room, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub that Elena decided immediately was the best part of the entire arrangement. It was furnished in warm neutrals, real art on the walls, windows facing the back garden where someone had planted a kitchen herb garden that was beginning to go green in the April soil. Matteo was not home when she arrived. Marco showed her around the townhouse with military efficiency, kitchen hours, household staff schedules. There were 2, a housekeeper named Rosa, who was 60 and disapproving in a way that felt, Elena thought, almost maternal, and a driver named Sal, who was 30 and largely silent. The alarm codes, the rules. The rules were posted, actually, on a single sheet of paper on the kitchen counter, in a font that suggested someone had thought carefully about the margins. Elena read them. House rules. 1. Breakfast is at 7. Dinner is at 7:30 if I'm home. You are not required to attend either. 2. The study on the second floor is private. Knock if the door is closed and wait for a response. 3. If you have concerns about safety or security, speak to Marco or Sal, not to anyone outside the household. 4. Appearances are required as scheduled. Ricci will send the weekly calendar. 5. In public, refer to me as Matteo, not Mr. Conti. 6. If anyone asks how we met, the coffee shop, 6 months ago. Keep it simple. Eleanor read Rule 6 twice. He'd used the coffee shop. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket. Rosa showed her the kitchen pantry with the air of someone granting access to a nuclear facility, made her a coffee without being asked, and left without a word. Elena sat at the kitchen island, drank the coffee, which was extraordinary, dark and almost sweet, the same quality as Morano's, and thought about what she'd done. She'd signed the contract. Her friend Diane had read it in full and confirmed it was legitimate. Aggressively so, she'd said, like the lawyer who wrote it was personally offended by ambiguity. Eleanor would be compensated monthly, transferred to a private account. She had a personal spending allowance. She was not, the contract specified clearly, expected to share a bedroom or perform any intimate role. Public appearances only, friendly, convincing, no more than that. She could leave with 30 days' notice under a specific set of conditions. The divorce would be uncontested and handled by the firm's legal team. She would keep everything she'd been paid. It was, all things considered, an extraordinarily good contract. She was sitting with her second cup of coffee when she heard the front door, and then footsteps on the stairs, and then Matteo appeared in the kitchen doorway in what she was fairly sure were slightly less formal clothes than she'd seen him in before. Dark trousers, a white shirt open at the collar, sleeves rolled to the elbows. He stopped when he saw her. "You're here," he said. "Monday," she reminded him. "You agreed." "I know. I didn't expect—" He stopped, came further into the kitchen, looked at the coffee cup. Something shifted in his expression, softening slightly at the edges. "Rosa made you coffee." "She did. She seemed reluctant about it. She's reluctant about everything for the first 6 months. He went to the machine, made himself one with the automatic ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times in this kitchen, and stood at the counter across from her. How was the move? Elena thought about this. Marco looked at my books like they'd personally offended him. The corner of Matteo's mouth moved, not quite a smile, a suggestion of one. "He's not a reader," Matteo said. "Are you?" He glanced toward the sitting room where she knew from Monday's tour there were shelves full of actual red books. "Yes." "What are you reading now?" He looked at her like she'd asked something unexpected again. "Camus," he said, in French. "The Stranger," "The Plague," cheerful choice. The corner of his mouth did the thing again. "I find it useful," he said, "for perspective." Elena drank her coffee. He drank his. The kitchen was quiet in a way that wasn't uncomfortable. It surprised her. That. She'd expected awkward, had prepared for it. But there was something in his silences that was inhabited rather than empty. He wasn't filling the space with performance, which meant she didn't have to either. "I have a question," she said. "You usually do." "The coffee shop. Rule 6, how we met. Did you put that because it was the simplest story or because it's actually true?" He looked at her over his coffee cup. "Both," he said. She nodded. My grandmother is going to love that story, he said, after a moment. When do I meet her? Saturday, there's a family dinner. He set his cup down. She knows it's sudden. I've told her we kept it quiet because of privacy. She's not naive, but she wants to believe it, which is enough. What's she like? Formidable, Matteo said. She will see through any performance you attempt. Don't attempt one. Just be yourself. What if myself isn't what she expects? That, he said, and this time the almost smile completed itself for a fraction of a second before retreating, is why I chose you. He took his coffee to the study on the second floor, knocked on nothing, it was his own door, and closed it behind him. Elena sat at the kitchen island and told her heart to behave itself. It did not particularly listen. The house in Lake Forest was 60 years old and looked like it had been built by someone who intended it to outlast everything. Wide and low fieldstone and old timber, with gardens that had the overgrown, layered density of genuine age. The circular drive had 6 other cars in it when Sal pulled the black SUV up to the front door, which meant Elena had underestimated the size of the family gathering. She had not, in fact, been told how many people would be there. How many people are going to be there? She asked, in the car, approximately 40 seconds before they arrived. Probably 30, Matteo said from beside her. Elena took a breath. You could have told me that. I should have told you that, he agreed, which was not quite an apology and was also not nothing. He was looking at the house, not at her, in the manner of a man steeling himself for something he would not admit required stealing. Are you nervous? She asked, because she was curious, and she had learned in 5 days of living in the same house as him that he responded better to directness than to anything else. No, he said. He paused. Slightly. About me. About her reaction. He turned from the window. She's not well. I don't know how... He stopped. I want this to be good for her. Eleanor looked at him, really looked, in the way she'd been careful not to do too often this week. In the space of 5 days, she'd assembled a partial picture. He was up before 6 every morning. She could hear him moving below. He worked in the study until mid-morning. He ate lunch at his desk, always. He was home for dinner 3 out of 5 days. When he was home, he was quiet, contained, and oddly easy to be around. Not warm exactly, but not cold either. He had the quality of still water, depth without display, and now slightly nervous about a sick old woman he was trying to make happy. It'll be good, Elena said. I'll make sure it is. He looked at her. You don't know that? No, she said. But I'm good at this kind of thing. People. Reading rooms. She smiled a little. I'm also very good at being sincere, which helps. He held her gaze for a moment. Right, he said. And something in his voice was different, lower, less businesslike. Thank you. They went inside. The 30 people turned out to be 32, ranging from a great-aunt who was 93 and needed 2 people to help her to her chair, to a pair of second cousins who were 7 and 11 and had the wild energy of children who'd been told to be good for approximately as long as they could stand it. There were aunts, uncles, cousins of cousins, an elderly priest who seemed to be a permanent family fixture, and Marco, who was apparently a distant cousin as well as an employee, and who managed to look both official and family dinner casual simultaneously. And there was Katerina. She was in a chair by the fireplace when Matteo led Elena into the main sitting room, and she was, as promised, formidable. Not in size. She was small, bird-boned, her hair a controlled silver, her hands folded in her lap over a dark shawl. But she had presence, the way certain spaces had presence, rooms that have held important things for long enough that they retain it, even when the things are gone. Her eyes were dark and very clear, and they went from Matteo's face to Elena's face, without hurry. "Nonna," Matteo said. He bent to kiss her cheek, and the gesture was so genuinely tender that Elena had to look at the fireplace for a moment. "This is Elena." "Come here," Katerina said to Elena. Her voice was lower than expected, rich, faintly accented still, after 60 years in America. Elena crossed the room and sat in the chair Marco had materialized beside Katerina's, and the old woman looked at her the way she might have looked at a painting she was trying to date, with patient, expert attention. "You're not afraid of him," Katerina said. She said it in the tone of an observation, not a question. "Should I be?" Elena said. Katerina's eyes shifted. Something in her expression changed, not softened, because Elena suspected Katerina's expressions had not softened since approximately 1975, but approved. "My grandson is a complicated man," she said. "Most women are afraid of complicated men." "I find them interesting," Elena said honestly. Katerina looked at Matteo, who was standing 3 feet away, trying, Elena could tell, to assess how this was going. "She's good," she told him. "I know," Matteo said. "Don't stand there hovering. Get us some wine and then go talk to your Uncle Enzo, who has been waiting to corner you about the Napoli property for 45 minutes. Matteo went. Katerina returned her attention to Elena. "Tell me how you met," she said. "The real version." "The coffee shop is the real version," Elena said. "I broke my umbrella in the rain. He picked it up." Katerina watched her. And then I got his attention in a way I wasn't expecting, I think, and she considered her words, "found me again." A pause. "He hasn't brought anyone to this house in 7 years." Elena said nothing. "He works too hard," Katerina said. "He has worked too hard since his father died. He thinks—" She paused, choosing carefully. "He thinks that the work is enough, that keeping everything running is the same as being alive." The dark eyes were steady. "It isn't." "No," Elena agreed softly. "You push back at him. It was not a question. When I think he's wrong, yes. Good." Katerina picked up Elena's hand from the arm of the chair, held it between both of hers. The grip was stronger than Elena expected. "That's what he needs. Someone who won't be managed." Elena thought about all the ways this arrangement was a performance, a contract, a transaction, and then she thought about Katerina's hands holding hers and the absolute absence of pretense in the old woman's eyes and felt something shift uncomfortably in her chest. "I'll try," Elena said. "Don't try," Katerina said. "Just be." She released her hand. "Now, tell me about Tucson. I've never been." They talked for 40 minutes. Dinner was called, and they moved to the long table. Elena between Matteo and one of the aunts, Julia, who was 60 and funny, and kept refilling Elena's wine glass while narrating family stories at a speed that suggested she'd been waiting years for a new audience. Across the table, one of the cousins was asking Matteo about the restaurant expansion. Matteo answered while simultaneously monitoring. Elena noticed approximately 6 different things: his grandmother's comfort, the energy of the table, whether the younger cousins were getting too restless, whether Elena was all right. He had the vigilance of someone responsible for a large, complicated thing, and he carried it so habitually that she wasn't sure he knew he was doing it. He caught her looking at him. She raised her wine glass very slightly. A small, private acknowledgement. This is going well. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he raised his own glass, almost imperceptibly, back. Something warm and inconvenient moved through Elena's chest. She turned back to Julia and asked for another story. The schedule settled into a rhythm that surprised Elena with its domesticity. Mornings, she established herself at the kitchen island with her laptop. She'd found a contract financial consulting position that she could do remotely, which she hadn't told Matteo about because she didn't need to, per the contract terms, but which made her feel better about the arrangement's architecture. She paid her own way in the parts of her life that were hers. The rest, the townhouse, the weekly appearances, the appropriate dresses Rosa occasionally left on her bed without explanation, those were the contract. Matteo was generally in the study until noon. If they crossed paths in the kitchen, they talked, briefly at first, then longer, in the way that conversations between people in the same space will build themselves up over time, like sediment. She told him about a tax code argument she'd found interesting. He told her about a complication with the Lake Forest property he was renovating. They discussed a book she was reading, The Name of the Rose, which he'd already read twice, in Italian, and then argued pleasantly and at some length about whether Umberto Eco was showing off. "He's showing off," Elena said. "He's being precise," Matteo said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." He'd looked at her with the expression she was starting to catalogue, the one where she'd said something that landed somewhere unexpected in him, and said, "No, they're not." There were appearances. The weekly calendar from Ricci materialized every Monday morning in her email. Dinners at the restaurants Matteo owned in his official capacity as their owner. Charity events of which he attended more than she'd expected. A gallery opening that turned out to be genuinely wonderful. Sunday dinners at Lake Forest twice a month, which Elena looked forward to. In a way, she was fairly careful not to examine too closely, because it was mostly Katerina she was looking forward to, and that felt, somehow, like the most complicated thing. The appearances were easier than she'd expected. Matteo was different in public, more contained, more deliberate, but the ease between them, which had built in the kitchen and the sitting room, and the occasional late dinner when he got home at 10 and she happened to still be reading at the kitchen island, translated naturally. They didn't have to perform warmth. It was there, something real underneath the arrangement, and Elena was careful about it the way you are careful about footing on uncertain terrain. She argued with him on a Thursday in May about the restaurant expansion. She hadn't meant to. She'd heard him on the phone in the kitchen, the rare occurrence of him taking a call downstairs rather than in the study, and the numbers he'd been discussing had caught her attention. And when he hung up, she'd looked up from her laptop and said, "The build-out cost for the River North location is too high." He'd turned from the window. "What?" "You're budgeting $3.2 million for the fit-out. I heard you tell someone that. For that square footage in that neighborhood, given current contractor rates, you're going to spend 4.5 minimum." Matteo looked at her. "You were listening to my call." "I was at the kitchen island, which is 12 feet from where you were standing. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the numbers were—" "They caught your attention," he said, with a slightly dry edge. I'm an accountant. Numbers catch my attention. I'm sorry. He was quiet for a moment. How do you know what contractor rates are in River North? I looked them up. I've been bored. The consulting work I've been doing is light on Thursdays. Another pause. You have consulting work. The contract doesn't restrict my professional activities, I checked. He pulled out the chair across from her at the island and sat down. He looked at her laptop, which she turned toward him. She'd been doing this idly, the way she did when numbers interested her, just mapping it out. He looked at the spreadsheet she'd built. He looked at it for a long time. Your contingency is too low, he said, pointing at a cell. I used industry standard. Industry standard assumes a competent project manager. Ours is, he paused, competent but optimistic. Elena adjusted the cell. Better? Run the financing column again. She did. They spent 40 minutes on the River North expansion. At the end of it, Matteo sat back and looked at her across the laptop screen with an expression she couldn't quite read. You're very good, he said. Not a compliment exactly, more of a calibration, adding data to a model. I know, she said simply. He almost smiled. You don't undervalue yourself. I used to, I stopped. She closed the laptop. Is this overstepping? He thought about this with the deliberateness he brought to things he was taking seriously. No, he said. It's useful if you're willing to keep doing it. I'm willing to keep doing it. He nodded. He got up, made them both coffee without asking, and put hers in front of her with the precision of someone who had learned, somewhere in the past 6 weeks, exactly how she took it. She had not told him how she took it. He'd noticed. Elena looked at the coffee, and then at him and told herself this was a transactional arrangement, and the fact that he'd learned her coffee preference was just evidence of his general observational skills and meant nothing personal whatsoever. Thank you, she said. It's nothing, he said. She believed neither of them. It was mid-June when the evening happened that changed things, though Elena would not name it that way until later. There was a reception at the Drake, a charity gala for a hospital foundation that counted among its significant donors both Conti family money and, apparently, a faction from a rival family that Matteo referred to as the Marchetti interests, in a tone that contained approximately 15 years of complicated history. Elena wore a dress that Rosa had, without consultation or apology, added to her wardrobe. Navy silk, simple, well cut. She arrived in the car with Matteo and noticed from the quality of his silence during the drive that this was a different kind of evening. Not the comfortable ones, but the ones where he was working. She slipped her hand into the crook of his arm in the lobby because it seemed right and she felt him register it. A slight adjustment in his bearing before he covered her hand with his briefly. The Marchetti son will be here, he said quietly as they approached the doors. Dante Marchetti, 32, ambitious, currently trying to position himself as a new generation peace broker between the families. Is he dangerous? Intelligent, which is the same thing. What do you need from me? He glanced at her. Be yourself. Don't be drawn into conversation with him alone. If he approaches you, when I'm not there, find a reason to move toward me. Subtle, Elena said. Subtle enough. The gala was beautiful in the way that expensive events are beautiful. Flowers, candlelight, women in good dresses, men performing ease in black tie. Matteo moved through it with the particular fluency of someone who'd been attending these things his whole life, introducing Eleanor as his wife with the kind of quiet certainty that left no room for doubt. His wife. She was still, 6 weeks in, faintly surprised by how naturally he said it. Dante Marchetti was, as advertised, intelligent. He was also unexpectedly warm, dark-eyed, gregarious, with a laugh that was quick and genuine, the kind of person who puts rooms at ease. He found them 40 minutes in and greeted Matteo with the careful friendliness of men who have decided to be cordial because the alternative is exhausting, and turned his attention to Elena with the kind of frank appreciation that was charming rather than intrusive. "I've been hearing about you," he said to her, while Matteo was momentarily in conversation with the Foundation's director, the mysterious Mrs. Conti. "Mysterious," Elena repeated. "I'm an accountant from Tucson." "And yet," Dante said, with a smile, "Matteo Conti married you quietly, which is the kind of thing that generates speculation in certain circles." "I imagine a lot of things generate speculation in your circles," Elena said pleasantly. Dante laughed. "Genuinely. That's true." He lowered his voice, not threateningly, but conspiratorially. "Can I ask you something honestly?" "You can ask." "Are you happy?" "With him?" Elena looked at him. "That's a strange question." "He's a complicated man," Dante said. "The women who've been around him, the ones I've known of, they learn to adjust themselves, become smaller, to fit what he needs." He shrugged. "You don't seem like someone who does that." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She was very aware that this was a conversation designed to produce something. Information, a reaction, a crack in the presentation. She was equally aware that Dante Marchetti was smart enough to know that she knew this, and that the conversation might nonetheless be sincere. "I'm not good at becoming smaller," she said. "He knows that, and he doesn't mind. He seems to prefer it." She said it simply, because it was true, and because it was the most confounding thing about the past 6 weeks, that Matteo Conti, who ran everything by precision and control, had never once asked her to be other than what she was. Dante studied her for a moment. Then he smiled. Different from before. Something more genuine and slightly rueful. "Good," he said. He could use that. Matteo appeared at her elbow. He looked at Dante, then at Elena, with an assessment that took approximately 1 second and registered everything. "Dante," he said. "Matteo." Dante raised his glass. "Congratulations on the marriage. She's extraordinary." "I know," Matteo said. His hand found the small of her back, light, steady. An instinct, she thought, not a performance. Dante moved on. Around them the gala continued its golden hum. Matteo leaned slightly toward her. What did he want? "To assess me," she said quietly, "to see if I was a gap in your armor." And I told him I wasn't. She looked up at him. "You should know that he's not your enemy. Or at least, he doesn't want to be." Matteo looked at her with something she couldn't entirely read. "How do you know?" "Because he told me the truth about you, which people who are playing angles don't do." She paused. "He said, the women around you learn to become smaller. He was surprised I hadn't." A silence. The hand at her back was still there. "Are you always this direct?" he said. "Usually." He was quiet for a moment. "What else did he say?" "That you could use someone who doesn't become smaller." She met his eyes. I thought you should know that your rival thinks you need the same thing I've been providing. Matteo held her gaze. There was something shifting in his expression, the usual precision, but underneath it, something with less armor. Elena, he said. Yes? He seemed to change course. We should— He nodded toward the far side of the room. The foundation table. Of course, she said. And they moved, his hand still at her back, and she thought, the contract. Remember the contract. And she did remember it. She just didn't particularly feel it right now, which was its own problem. Late June, and a storm came off the lake that was serious enough to rattle the townhouse windows and knock a small tree in the back garden sideways. Elena was awake at midnight. She'd always been a light sleeper in storms, sitting in the window seat of her sitting room with a book and a blanket, and the particular pleasure of being dry inside while the world outside was furiously wet. She heard footsteps on the stairs, and then a knock at her sitting room door. Yes, she called. Matteo opened the door. He was in what she'd come to think of as his off-hours clothes, dark lounge trousers, an old grey sweater, reading glasses pushed up into his hair in a way she'd noticed he did when he'd been working late and forgot they were there. He looked, in this particular configuration, significantly less like a man who ran a family organization and significantly more like a person. The tree in the back, he said. I wanted to check the window on this side. It takes the wind differently. She moved aside on the window seat. He leaned across her, checked the latch, seemed satisfied, and then didn't immediately leave. He looked at the rain running down the glass. You're awake, he observed. Storms, she said. I've always been a light sleeper in storms. He looked at her book. The Plague. She'd borrowed from his shelf. He'd told her to take anything she wanted. She'd taken this one deliberately, because she was curious. How is it? He said. Sad, she said, and oddly comforting. Yes. He sat, not on the window seat, on the ottoman nearby, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, in a posture she'd never seen from him before. He looked out of the window at the storm. My father used to read me Camus, he said, in Italian. When I was small, I didn't understand most of it, but I liked the sound. Elena set her book down. What was he like? Careful, Matteo said, after a moment. Very careful man. Not cold, careful. There's a difference. He loved us, but he loved us like he was always calculating whether he could afford to. He paused. I think I became like that. A little, Elena said. He looked at her. A little? You're more present than you think you are, she said. You notice things, Rosa's coffee, my books, the way you watch the whole room at your grandmother's dinners, making sure everyone is all right. She held his gaze. That's not someone who doesn't love people. That's someone who's afraid of what happens when he does. Silence. The rain moved against the window. You've been here 6 weeks, Matteo said slowly. I know. You shouldn't know things like that. Probably not, Elena agreed. I'm sorry if it's— Don't, he said. Don't apologize. He was looking at her with the directness that she'd gotten almost used to, the grey eyes, the full attention. You're right. I know you're right. She waited. My father was killed, he said, in the tone of someone who has said this many times and has made it flat by repetition. I was 22. I took over, and He stopped. I learned not to need things. It's efficient. If you don't need things, no one can use them against you. Yes, Elena said softly, but it's also very lonely. He looked at the rain. Yes, he said. They sat in the storm for a while, neither of them speaking, and the silence was the kind that builds rather than the kind that empties. Elena pulled her blanket tighter and watched the rain, and Matteo sat with his elbows on his knees and his reading glasses forgotten in his hair, and at some point the distance between where she was sitting and where he was sitting felt different from how it had felt when he came in. "My mother died when I was 14, Elena said, because it felt like the kind of conversation where things matched. Car accident. My dad. He was there. He was fine. She wasn't." She paused. "I became very good at taking care of things after that. The house, my dad's paperwork, the logistics. I got efficient." She smiled a little, ruefully. "We're not so different in that way." He turned to look at her. "I didn't know about your mother." "It wasn't in the background check?" "No. She died in Arizona. Not much of a paper trail." She looked at the rain. "She would have found this." She gestured vaguely at the window, the house, the arrangement. "Completely hilarious." Would she? She had a very specific sense of humor about things being dramatically complicated. She would have approved of the dress Rosa picked. She'd have told me the contract was a terrible idea, and also that the man was worth it. The silence that followed had a quality she couldn't name. "Eleanor?" he said, very quietly. She looked at him. He was close. At some point he'd moved forward on the ottoman, or she'd moved on the window seat, or both. She could see the exact silver thread of his scar through his eyebrow. "This is more complicated than I planned," he said. His voice was low, stripped of the usual precision. "I want you to know that I know that." "It's all right," she said. "It's not all right in terms of the contract." "I know what the contract says," she said. "Matteo." It was the first time she'd used his name without the formal context of a public appearance, and she watched it register on his face. "I know what the contract says. I also know what's happening, and I'm not—" She stopped, took a breath. "I'm not afraid of it. You should be careful." "You keep telling me to be careful," she said. "I'm a 26-year-old accountant from Tucson who agreed to a fake marriage for money. I think the time for careful was probably about 8 weeks ago." Something happened on his face. Not the almost smile, something fuller, something that reached his eyes, and his eyes were, when they did that, quite remarkable. He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face. It was a gentle gesture, simple, and it landed with the weight of something that had been held back for a long time. "Good night, Elena," he said. He stood. He went to the door. "Matteo," she said. He stopped. "Good night," she said. He went. Elena sat in the window seat for a long time, listening to the storm, her heart doing several complicated things that she did not immediately name, but which she thought, in the honest accounting section of her mind, she probably should. The next morning, she came downstairs to find Matteo in the kitchen earlier than usual, earlier than she'd ever seen him, in fact. The espresso machine still hissing through its first cycle of the day, the windows still grey with pre-dawn light. He was standing at the counter, reading something on his phone, with the particular stillness of a man who has been awake for a while. He looked up when she came in. Something crossed his face. Not the armor she'd expected, not any kind of retreat from the previous night. Just acknowledgement. The same directness as always, with something additionally present underneath it. "You're up early," she said. "I didn't sleep much." She went to the machine, made her coffee. He waited, and the waiting had a quality, patient, attentive, that she was learning to read as a kind of care. "The storm passed," she said, looking out at the garden where the knocked-over tree had been righted, presumably by Sal or Marco before anyone else was awake. Yes. She turned to look at him. He was watching her, with the grey eyes that were, at this hour, in this grey light, very open. "About last night," she said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." She held her coffee cup with both hands. "I meant what I said. I'm not afraid of it, of whatever this is becoming. I just wanted you to know that I'm not going to pretend it isn't happening, or make it convenient for you by backing away from it." He was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet she'd learned was him thinking rather than deflecting. "I don't want you to back away from it," he said. He said it carefully, the way he said things he was certain of. "I want to be honest with you about the fact that I don't know what to do with it." "That's the most honest thing you've said to me," Elena said. A short silence. "I know." "It's enough," she said. "For now." He looked at her. She looked at him. The kitchen was quiet and grey, and the coffee was warm in her hands, and she thought, "This is enough. This is exactly enough." The not knowing alongside the honesty about the not knowing, that was more than most people offered. "Ricci is coming at 10, he said after a moment, the practical man reasserting himself, "for the quarterly review. I'll be out of your way." "You don't have to be." He paused. "You could sit in, if you wanted. Your read on the Ferrano financials was more useful than his last quarter." Elena looked at him. "You're inviting me into a business meeting." "A quarterly review," he said carefully, "for the legitimate entities." But still, he agreed. She sat in. Ricci spent the first 10 minutes looking at her the way Marco had looked at her book box, with polite, baffled adjustment. By the end of the first hour, he'd stopped looking at her at all and was talking to Matteo as if she were simply part of the furniture, which meant he'd decided she was trustworthy. Elena had learned that this was the highest form of professional acceptance from men who spent their lives calculating trust, the moment they forgot to perform around you. Matteo caught her eye once, at a moment when she'd corrected a depreciation figure that Ricci's firm had calculated incorrectly, and the expression on his face was the calibration one, adding new data to the model. But there was something else underneath it that she was beginning to recognize as something like pride, not proprietary, simply glad. She filed that away, too, in the folder she'd finally named. July arrived with a heat that settled over Chicago like a hand pressing down. The townhouse had good air conditioning, and Eleanor had developed the habit of working in the back garden in the mornings when it was still cool, at a wrought-iron table under the pergola where the herb garden ran along the low wall. Matteo found her there on a Tuesday, which was when he normally left for the Loop offices early and didn't return until evening. She looked up from her laptop to find him standing in the garden doorway in his suit holding 2 espresso cups. "You're supposed to be in meetings," she said. "I cancelled the morning." He set a cup in front of her. "Ricci is handling the preliminary." She watched him sit across from her, which was something he'd never done before, joined her in the garden. He looked at the herb garden with the slightly unfocused attention of a man who isn't quite thinking about what he's looking at. "I'm having problems with the Ferrano situation," he said. "I want your read on something." "I'm an accountant." "I know. I want your read on the money, not the people." She looked at him for a moment. "Matteo, showing me the money is showing you the people." "I know," he said. "I know that. He met her eyes. I trust you. She was quiet for a moment. The word hung between them in the morning air with a gravity that was disproportionate to its syllables. Tell me, she said. He talked for 40 minutes. She listened, asked questions, pulled up a new spreadsheet, and mapped what he described. The Ferrano family had been skimming distribution margins for 18 months by routing through 3 shell companies, 2 of which were registered in names that were, according to what Matteo was telling her, connected to a larger political play. An attempt to build a financial base for expanding their territory, she traced it. She built the model. Here, she said, turning the laptop. This is what they're doing. The shell companies clear this account, she pointed, which feeds into this one here, which pays out to what looks like a legitimate logistics supplier, but isn't. They're building a war chest. Matteo looked at the screen. His jaw was set. Can I ask you something? Elena said. Yes. What happens when you confront this? To the Ferranos? He looked at her steadily. Consequences, he said. Not lethal ones. That's not how these things are resolved in this decade, generally. Financial pressure, loss of contracts, social isolation. You're sure? Elena. His voice was gentle. I told you, the night in your sitting room, I'm not going to involve you in anything you can't live with. I know you told me, she said. I'm asking because I want to confirm it's still true. He held her gaze. It's still true. She looked at the screen, looked at him, made a decision that she was aware was a decision, that she was crossing something, and made it anyway. Then there's another pathway, she said. You don't confront it directly. You make it visible to the people above them in the structure, the ones who don't want instability. You let them handle the internal consequences. It's cleaner, less visible, and it sends a message that you know what they did without making it a war. Matteo stared at her. You can tell who those people are, she said, from the financial structure, the beneficial owners of the top account. Here, she pointed. That's where the pressure should go. A long silence. How? Matteo said, slowly. Do you know how this works? I'm an accountant, Elena said. I spent 2 years at Kellerman Group. Kellerman, before the reorganization, had 3 clients whose money I did not look at too hard because it wasn't my job to look too hard. She paused. I'm looking too hard now, but the structure is the same. Matteo was looking at her with an expression she'd never quite seen before. Not the calibration look, not the assessing look. Something closer to wonder, maybe, or the functional equivalent of it in a man who had carefully trimmed wonder out of his operating system years ago. You continue to surprise me, he said. Is that good? Yes. He said it without hesitation. Extremely. She closed the laptop. The morning was warming, the garden smelling of basil and thyme. A bird was doing something enthusiastic in the linden tree by the wall. Matteo, she said. I need to tell you something. He looked up. The contract, she said carefully. The 6 months. I think you should know that I'm not. That what I'm doing here, what we've been... She stopped, tried again. I'm not acting, she said. In the parts that aren't the public appearances. I haven't been acting for a while. I think you should know that. He was very still. I'm not telling you to do anything about it, she said, because honesty felt like the only navigable path, and she was good at navigating. I'm not asking for anything to change. I just thought you deal better with accurate information. Yes, he said. I do. So that's the accurate information. He stood from the table. He crossed the 3 feet between them, and he stood looking down at her with those smoke-grey eyes doing the thing where they held the full weight of his attention. "Eleanor," he said. His voice was the quiet version. "Yes." "I haven't been acting either," he said. "For longer than I'd like to admit, and I don't know what to do with that. Exactly because—" He stopped. "Because the contract," she said. "Because you deserve better than a man who wrote you a contract," he said. She looked up at him. "I accepted the contract," she said, voluntarily, with full information. She tilted her head slightly. "What would you be without the contract?" He seemed to actually think about this. "Complicated," he said finally. "Dangerous in certain technical senses. Difficult. Isolated by necessity." He paused. "Better possibly with someone who argues with you," she said. "Who argues with me?" he agreed. She stood up from the wrought-iron chair. They were the same close distance as the coffee shop floor, as the garden air, as every place they'd inhabited in the weeks of building toward this. "Tear it up," she said. He looked at her. "The contract," she said. "Or renegotiate it to something we actually mean. Because I'm not leaving in 6 months, Matteo. I made that decision somewhere around the storm, or maybe the second Sunday at Lake Forest, or possibly the spreadsheet just now. I can't place it precisely, but I'm not leaving." He reached out and held her face in both hands, careful and certain, and looked at her for a long moment, the way you look at something you'd been careful not to want, and then wanted anyway. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm extremely sure," she said. "I'm very rarely uncertain about numbers. I'm less uncertain about people than most people think I am. And I am completely certain about you." He kissed her. It was not the first kiss of a business arrangement. It was not careful or calculated. It was warm and thorough, and it contained, Elena thought, somewhere behind the warmth of it, the weeks of careful suppression releasing all at once, like a room when you finally open all the windows. When they separated, the garden was golden with morning light, and the basil was warm in the heat, and a bird was still doing its enthusiastic thing in the linden tree. "I'll talk to Ricci," Matteo said. "Tell him to bill for the original 6 months," Elena said. "I don't want the money back." He looked at her. "Elena, I came in for the money," she said. "I'm staying for you. Those are different things, and I want them to stay that way." She picked up her laptop. "Now, about the Ferrano situation." He laughed. She'd heard him laugh before, rarely, briefly, but this one was full and genuine and surprised, and it completely changed his face. "Yes," he said, when he'd stopped. He was looking at her with an expression that was new to his face in the time she'd known him, open, a fraction unguarded, happy. "Let's talk about the Ferrano situation." Caterina knew before anyone told her. Elena figured this out at the July dinner, when the old woman took one look at them coming through the door, together, Matteo's hand in hers, not for the performance of it, but because it was where his hand had been on the drive over, and said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "Finally." She said it in Italian, but Elena was picking up Italian because Rosa had started teaching her in the mornings before the household woke up, in a development that neither of them acknowledged was a development, and she understood finalmente well enough. She caught Caterina's eye across the room, and the old woman smiled, a real one, small and private, the kind that required her whole face. "You love him," Katerina said to her later, in the garden after dinner, the two of them sitting with their wine while the men were inside arguing about a football match. Yes, Eleanor said. She'd stopped being surprised by how direct she could be with Katerina. It was like talking to someone who had already read the chapter you were still in. He loves you, Katerina said. He doesn't know what to do about it. He's learning. He will be stubborn about it. I know. And difficult. I'm aware. And dangerous in certain technical senses, Katerina said, the same phrase Eleanor had used to Matteo, which meant he'd told his grandmother about the conversation, which Elena found more moving than she quite knew how to categorize. Yes, Elena said. And you're not afraid? Of him? No. Elena looked at the garden. Of losing him, maybe. That's a different thing. Katerina was quiet for a moment. My husband, she said finally, was also a complicated man, dangerous in certain technical senses. The old eyes were distant, warm. I was afraid of many things in 60 years. Losing him was the one I could never prepare for. She looked at Elena. You're good for him. And he is, underneath all of it, a good man. He chose to be, which is harder than being born one. Elena thought about this for a long time. Thank you, she said, for telling me that. Don't thank me, Katerina said. Marry him properly when you're ready. Do it in the church in Lake Forest. Invite too many people. Have the dinner go too long. She picked up her wine glass. That's all I want. I think we can do that, Elena said. Good. Katerina raised her glass. Now tell me what you're reading. I haven't had anyone to argue about books with since Father Benedetti retired. Elena raised her glass back. The Plague, she said. I've been reading it twice. In September, they had their first serious argument, which was the kind of argument that tests the structure of a thing to see whether it holds. It was about Elena's safety. Specifically, a complication in the Ferrano matter had made it necessary, Matteo determined, for Elena to have a driver and a visible security presence whenever she left the townhouse. He told her this at dinner, in the tone of a decision that had already been made. Elena set her fork down. No, she said. Matteo looked at her. It's not a discussion, Elena. You made it a discussion by informing me rather than asking me, she said. I understand there's a risk situation. I would like to understand the specifics so I can make my own assessment. My assessment is sufficient. Your assessment is about me. I'm a relevant party to decisions about me. His jaw set. She recognized this, the moment when his control instinct kicked in, when the habit of managing everything tightened. The Ferrano situation is more complicated than I represented, he said carefully. Someone is watching the house. It's precautionary. Then tell me that, Elena said. Don't announce a decision about my movements as if I'm... She stopped. I am not someone you manage, Matteo. I told you that in the beginning. I'm trying to keep you safe. Then work with me on it, not around me. She held his gaze. I will accept a driver. I will accept security measures that we agree on together. I will not accept being managed like an asset. The silence was long. His jaw was still set. But underneath the control instinct, she could see him hearing her. The man watching the house, she said more quietly. Do you know who he reports to? We think so. Is it connected to the shell company's structure? The top-level accounts? He looked at her. You think it's retaliation for the financial pressure? I think it might be. In which case, she reached for the laptop she kept on the kitchen sideboard now habitually. Let me look at something. He watched her work for 10 minutes. She traced a connection she'd half noticed a week ago and hadn't followed because it hadn't seemed relevant yet. "There," she said, turning the screen. "The surveillance isn't Ferrano. It's someone they contracted, an outside firm, which means it's not retaliatory. It's ongoing intelligence gathering. Someone commissioned this before the financial pressure started." Matteo leaned over the screen. He looked at the structure for a long time. "That's the Marchetti connection," he said quietly. "Dante's people?" "His father's." He straightened. "This changes things." "Yes." She looked at him. "So, I'll take the driver, and we're going to figure this out together." He looked at her for a long moment. The jaw unclenched degree by degree. "Together," he said. "That's what the word means," she said, not unkindly. He pulled her chair around, very deliberately, so she was facing him rather than the laptop. He held her face in his hands, the gesture she'd come to know as his most honest one, the one that bypassed everything else. "I'm sorry," he said. "You're right. I was managing. I know. I do it because the people you've loved, who were in danger," she said softly, "you couldn't always protect." His breath was slow. "Yes, I know," she said again. "Matteo, I'm not going anywhere. But I need you to trust me with the reality of our life. All of it. Not the managed version. The reality of our life," he repeated, and something in his voice made the words warm. "Yes," she said. "Ours." He kissed her forehead, then her temple, then the corner of her jaw, in a progression that was deliberate and tender. She leaned into it. "Together, then," he said against her hair. "Together," she agreed. The Marchetti situation resolved itself in October through exactly the kind of negotiation that Elena had predicted was possible. Not a war, but a conversation, managed through intermediaries, resulting in an agreement that Dante himself brokered when it became clear his father's intelligence operation was generating more exposure risk than value. Dante called Matteo. They met, with lawyers and without weapons, in a restaurant that was determinedly neutral. Elena was not there, but she'd spent 2 evenings helping Matteo prepare, not the strategic angles, he didn't need her for those, but the financial arguments, the clean presentation of the shell company evidence, the way to frame the damage without making it a threat. He came home at 10 o'clock, loosening his tie in the hallway. She was at the kitchen island where she spent half her evenings now, the laptop replaced with a glass of wine and a book, because the consulting work had expanded enough that she stopped needing to work evenings, which was its own kind of progress. He walked into the kitchen, poured himself a glass from the bottle she'd opened, and sat across from her. "Well," she said. "Resolved," he said. "Clean? Cleaner than it should have been. He actually—" a pause. "He said you'd been right about him not being an enemy." Elena held her wineglass. "And?" "And I told him I knew." He looked at her across the island. "I'm very good at knowing which information is accurate and which isn't." "You are," she agreed. "I'm especially good," he said, slower, "when I have someone who provides accurate information without being asked." She smiled. "I'm an accountant." "You're extremely much more than an accountant," he said. She looked at him. He was tired. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the slight loosening that came at the end of a long day. But underneath the tiredness was something she'd been watching grow for months. Ease. He was easier in this kitchen than he'd been in June. Less watchful, less armored. Not unguarded, He was too careful a man for that, and probably always would be. But there were places, with her, where the armour came off, and she'd stopped cataloguing them and started simply being glad of them. "Matteo," she said. I love you." She hadn't said it before. She'd let it build in the structure of things, in the spreadsheets and the storm window, and the garden mornings, and the arguments, and the way he held her face. But she hadn't said it in words, because she was precise about words. He went very still. "Elena." His voice was the quiet version. "You don't have to say it back," she said. "I know you. It takes you time to trust things enough to say them. That's all right. I'm telling you because it's true, not because I need you to answer it." He stood up from the island. He walked around to her side. He took the wine glass from her hand and set it down and looked at her with the full weight of those grey eyes and said, "I love you." He said it the way he said things he'd decided, completely, without qualification, as if the deciding was the last uncertain part, and the saying was just the evidence of it. "I've been trying," he said, "to determine the exact moment it became this. I can't. It was too gradual, and then all at once, and I'm not—" He stopped. "I'm not experienced at this." "I know," she said. "I'll do it wrong sometimes. We both will. I'm not easy. I don't want easy." She took his hand. "I want you." He pulled her to him, not tentatively, but with the decision quality of everything he did. And she was in his arms, with her face against his throat, and the kitchen was warm around them, and the October dark was outside, and this, she thought, was the accurate information. This was the real thing. He held her for a long time, not speaking, because he didn't need words when the decision was made. That was something she'd learned about him. He was a man of very few words that meant everything, and very precise actions that said the rest. She believed him completely. Rosa, who had been disapproving since June, made Elena a birthday cake in November. It was an Italian almond cake, dense and sweet, with a powdered sugar dusting, and Rosa set it on the kitchen island before Elena was awake and left before Elena could thank her, which was clearly intentional. There was a note that said simply, "You take care of him. That matters." Elena read the note 3 times. She was still reading it when Matteo came into the kitchen at 6:30, and she held it up to show him. He read it. His expression did the thing where it softened without quite softening. "She doesn't write notes," he said. "So I gathered." He poured the coffee, hers first, always, in the exact configuration she liked, and sat across from her at the island. The cake was between them, and the note was on the counter, and the November morning was grey and damp through the windows. "Happy birthday," he said. He slid a small box across the island. Elena looked at it. "Matteo." "Open it." She opened it. Inside was a ring, not a flashy one, not the kind that announced itself from across the room. A single oval sapphire, the colour of deep water, on a simple gold band. It was exactly what she would have chosen if anyone had asked her, which they had not, which meant he'd arrived at it by knowing her. She looked up at him. "Not the contract ring," he said. "I want to be clear. That was—" He set his coffee down. "I want to give you a real one. When you're ready, if you want to." "We're already technically married," she said. "On paper." His voice was low. "I want to marry you when you know everything, all of it, the full reality." Not the version I presented in June. I know more now than I did in June, she said. There's more. She looked at the ring in the box. Tell me the rest, she said. All of it. He did. He talked for an hour. He told her about his father's death and how it had happened, the actual mechanics, the violence, the consequences. He told her about the decisions he'd made in the 4 years after, the ones he was proud of, and the ones that lived differently in him. He told her about the organization in its accurate dimensions, not the catastrophized version and not the euphemistic one. He told her where he drew lines and why, and where the lines had moved over time and where they were now. He told her all of it, in the grey November morning, with the birthday cake between them. She listened. She asked questions. He answered them, all of them, without deflecting or managing. She could see what it cost him, the vulnerability of the full accounting. He was a man who had protected himself by controlling what was known, and this was the opposite of that. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she picked up the ring. She put it on her finger. I'm ready, she said. He looked at the ring on her hand. Something moved through his expression that she had no word for in any language. Elena? You asked if I wanted to, she said. I want to. The real thing. The Lake Forest church, the too many people, the dinner that goes too long. She held his gaze. I know what I'm saying yes to. All of it. The real version. He crossed the kitchen and held her face in his hands and kissed her, the way he kissed her, now, with all of it present, nothing held back. And when he stopped, he pressed his forehead against hers and was very still. I don't deserve you, he said quietly. I want you to know I know that. You don't have to deserve someone, Eleanor said. You have to show up for them. She pulled back enough to see his face. You show up, Matteo, every day, in every way that matters. She touched the scar through his eyebrow very gently. That's the whole thing. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the grey was warm and unguarded in a way that still, 5 months in, had the capacity to stop her breath. The contract, he said. Is done, she said. Has been done for a while. Yes, he said. It has. He kissed her again. Rosa's cake sat on the island in the November morning, patient and sweet. He told her one more thing in December, on a night when the cold had come off the lake so hard it made the windows hum. They were in the sitting room on the second floor. His sitting room, which had become, without negotiation, the room they spent their evenings in. She was on the sofa, with a book. He was at the desk, but the pen had been still for 10 minutes, and she'd noticed. What is it? She said, without looking up. A pause. How do you do that? Do what? Know when I'm trying to say something. She put her book down. You go still, a different kind of still than the regular kind. He turned from the desk. He looked at her and across the warm room with the lamplight between them, and she could see that this was the difficult one, whatever this was, the kind that required the most of him. I almost didn't come into the coffee shop that morning, he said. In April, Ricci had the meeting set at Morano's, and I almost sent Marco instead. There was a conflict with... It doesn't matter. I almost didn't go. Elena looked at him. I've thought about that a lot, he said. The alternate version of that morning. You sitting there, with your broken umbrella and me not being there too. And then the whole sequence that didn't happen. She was quiet for a moment. What made you go? Habit. My grandfather built that place. I go every Tuesday when I'm in the city. He paused. It was a habit that turned out to matter very much. She set her book on the side table and crossed the room to the desk. She sat on the edge of it, which she did sometimes when the distance between the sofa and the chair was too much. He turned his chair toward her. "I was going to give up," she said. "On Chicago, I had it planned. If Hartley didn't work out and this mysterious Meridian thing didn't work out, I was going back to Tucson. I'd already looked at apartments." He looked at her. "You didn't tell me that. I didn't tell you a lot of things in the beginning. You hired someone to do a job. I didn't lead with my interior life. And now?" His voice was careful, in the way it was when he was being deliberate about something. "And now," she said, "you are my interior life, mostly." He reached over and took her hand from her lap, held it in both of his, the way Katerina had held it at the first dinner. The comparison, she thought, would have made him uncomfortable if she'd said it out loud. She saved it. "I'm glad I went to the coffee shop," he said simply. "I'm glad my umbrella was broken," she said. He almost smiled. It finished this time, fully, in the lamplight. "I'm going to be better at this," he said. "At saying things I know I'm not." "You're better than you think," she said. "And I'm patient." "You're not, particularly." "I'm patient with you." She squeezed his hand. "Specifically, and only you." He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to the back of it, which was not something he did often and which, when he did it, never failed to make her feel like someone had rewritten the temperature of the room. "February," he said. "February," she confirmed. Katerina was better in December. Not well, the doctors were still careful in their optimism, but better. And she sat at the head of the Christmas dinner table at Lake Forest as if she'd never intended to do anything else, in a dark red dress and her mother's pearl earrings, and toasted the assembled family with a glass of Barolo and a look that said she'd expected all of this all along, and merely had the grace to look pleased rather than smug about it. Marco, who had at some point gone from suspicious to quietly fond of Elena, in the way of people who are protective of someone they care about, and have decided to extend that protection to the person who clearly cares about them in return, had stopped making the expression he'd made when he carried her book box in June. He still sometimes appeared at inconvenient moments which Elena understood was just the architecture of the life, and she'd stopped being startled by it. After dinner, while the house was warm and loud with family, Matteo found her in the front room looking at a photograph on the wall. She'd noticed it before, had always been going to ask about it. A black and white photo of a young couple on what looked like a Neapolitan street, early 60s, the woman laughing at something off camera, and the man watching her with an expression that was completely visible from 60 years in the past. "Your grandparents," she said, as he came to stand beside her. "Their wedding day," he said. She told the photographer she didn't want to pose, she only wanted him to take the pictures of the real moments. Elena looked at Katerina's young face, the laugh, the complete lack of performance. "That's how you knew," she said. "About choosing someone real over choosing someone right." "It was the picture I looked at," he said. "When Ricci was telling me about the candidates," she looked at him. "You decided that day in my sitting room in the storm. You decided before we had that conversation." "I was trying to decide responsibly," he said. "I wanted to tell you everything first. And then I told you I wasn't acting." "Yes," he looked at the photograph, "and I thought, she's looking at me the way my grandmother looked at the camera, like she's not performing anything." Eleanor leaned slightly against him. He put his arm around her. "February," she said. "The church, like she asked." "February," he agreed. They stood in the front room looking at the 60-year-old photograph of a woman laughing on a Naples street, while behind them the house was full of family and warmth and the specific noise of a large Italian family's Christmas that goes on slightly too long, in the best possible way. January in Chicago is not a month for romance, generally speaking. It is a month for staying inside, for wind that comes off the lake like a warning, for the kind of cold that makes the city feel both harder and more honest than it does in softer seasons. Elena had spent 2 Januaries in Chicago and had developed specific coping mechanisms: good wool socks, the particular Italian roast that Rosa made, and an aggressive relationship with her reading list. This January was different, in the way that everything was different on the near side of a decision. She had moved, properly and fully, into what had been Matteo's bedroom. A fact that had required no announcement, no negotiation, that had simply happened over the course of 2 weeks in November with the organic inevitability of water finding its level. Her books had migrated to the shelves alongside his. Her reading glasses ended up on his nightstand. His grey sweater, the old one, the one he wore when he wasn't being anyone's idea of Matteo Conti, ended up folded on her side of the chair. She'd stopped keeping track of whose things were whose, which was itself a kind of accounting. The days had a shape she hadn't planned but had begun, quietly, to love. Early mornings, him awake first. Always, the coffee made by the time she came downstairs, the light in the kitchen still thin and blue. She would sit at the island with her mug, and he would be at the counter going through whatever the day's first briefing was, physical papers. Always a habit she'd once asked about, and he'd said, simply because screens can be captured, and they would exist together in the specific way of people who have learned to share silence without filling it. Middays she consulted. Her client list had grown. She'd taken on 2 new firms in the fall, and one of them, a small family-owned real estate development company in Pilsen, had become genuinely interesting. She worked from the garden table in the summer, from the kitchen island in colder months, from the sitting room when she needed to think without looking at anything specific. Evenings were variable. When Matteo was home before 8, they ate together. Rosa, who had completed her transition from disapproval to something that still wasn't warmth exactly but was in the neighborhood of it, made dinners that were considerably more elaborate than the household required, a fact Elena suspected was less about food and more about the old woman's need to demonstrate care in the only language she consistently offered it. Elena had learned to eat Rosa's cooking with the specific gratitude of someone who understands they're receiving something beyond the food. She called her father on Sundays. He'd visited twice, once in November for her birthday, once over the holidays. And each time he'd come back quieter than he'd left, which was how he showed that he was moved by things. He'd called her the week after Christmas and said, "He's careful with you." "Yes," she'd said. "That's the right word. I've been thinking about what the right word was." "He is," she said, "in the way that matters." Her father had been quiet for a moment. "Your mother," he said, and then stopped. And she understood. She knew what her mother would have thought. She'd known it since the storm window night. January also brought, in its second week, a Sunday afternoon when Katerina called the townhouse rather than Matteo's mobile, which she sometimes did when she wanted to talk to Elena without the layer of Matteo being present. Elena had learned to recognize these calls and to take them in the kitchen with a cup of tea, which was the correct configuration. "The wedding," Katerina said, without preamble. "Have you chosen a date?" "The 15th, Elena said. "February 15th, Father DiMaggio confirmed the church." A small sound of satisfaction from the other end. "Good. And the dinner after?" "Julia is handling the dinner." "Then it will be too much food and go on too long," Katerina said. "Exactly as it should be." A pause. "How is he?" Elena thought about the coffee made before she came downstairs, the grey sweater on the chair, the way he'd looked at her on Christmas in the front room with the photograph of his grandparents. "He's good," she said. He's very good, Katerina." Another pause. Longer. "I know it was an unusual beginning," the old woman said, carefully. "The contract, the arrangement, I know what I asked of him and what it meant." "You asked him not to die alone," Elena said. "That's what he told me you said." "It was the plainest version," Katerina said. "I was worried he needed the plain version." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know it would be this particular person, but I'm glad it was." Eleanor looked out the kitchen window at the January garden, bare and patient, under a thin skin of frost. "So am I," she said. "You'll be good for the family," Katerina said. "Not because you fit it. You don't entirely, and that's correct. But because you understand things, the shape of it, the way it works." The old voice was precise. "That understanding is different from belonging. It's more durable." Elena considered this. It was one of those Katerina statements that required time to unfold completely, that you had to carry for a while before you knew all of what it contained. "I'll try to be worthy of it," Elena said. "Don't try," Katerina said, which was exactly what she'd said in the beginning, at the first dinner, in the chair by the fire. "Just be?" Elena smiled into the kitchen. "Yes," she said. "I know." Marco appeared at the kitchen island on a Wednesday morning in the week before the wedding, which was unusual because Marco generally performed his household management and security functions at a remove that respected the domestic rhythms of the house. He stood on the other side of the island from Elena with the expression of a man who has something to say and has rehearsed the beginning of it, but not the middle. Elena looked up from her laptop. "Marco." "Elena." He sat. Also unusual. He was almost always standing, as if sitting constituted a reduction in vigilance he couldn't afford. He put both hands flat on the island, which she recognized as his particular version of making himself vulnerable to something. "I want to say something," he said, "before Saturday." She closed the laptop. "All right." He was quiet for a moment. She waited because she'd learned that Marco's silences, like Matteo's, were working silences and not empty ones. "When he told me about the arrangement," Marco said carefully, "in April, I thought it was a mistake. I said so. He doesn't take my opinions on his personal life generally, but I said so anyway." He looked at the island surface. "I thought you'd be wrong for him, someone who didn't understand, someone who'd have to be managed." Elena said nothing. She understood this was going somewhere. "You've never had to be managed," Marco said, with the slight bewilderment of a man who finds this confusing even now. "I've watched for 9 months and you've never had to be managed, which means he's not managing anything with you, and—" He stopped, started again. "He's different. He laughs more." He argues about books with someone who argues back. He went to the garden on a Tuesday morning in July for no reason I could identify. A pause. That was the day I changed my assessment. Elena looked at him. The Tuesday morning. He cancelled the morning meetings for the first time in 4 years, Marco said, and went to sit in the garden with coffee and a woman who was reading a spreadsheet. It was. He seemed to search for the word. It was new. It was, Elena agreed. I want to tell you, Marco said, arriving finally at the thing he'd come to say, that I'm glad you stayed. And that whatever this family is, whatever it requires, I'll make sure nothing gets to you. That's my job. It was already my job, but now it means something different than it did. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She thought about what it cost Marco to say this, a man who communicated primarily through proximity and vigilance and the occasional dry observation, whose emotional language was almost entirely structural. This was not easy for him. She recognized the cost of it, because she'd watched Matteo pay similar prices in the early weeks. "Thank you," she said. "I know that wasn't easy to say." "It was not," Marco confirmed with some feeling. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "You're stuck with me." Something almost happened on Marco's face. Almost. "I'm aware," he said, in the tone he used when he meant the opposite of what his words suggested. He stood up, regulation vigilance reasserted, and moved toward the hallway. "Marco," she said. He stopped. "Are you bringing a date to the wedding?" The pause was the longest she'd ever produced in him. "No," he said finally, at a register that implied this question was impertinent and also slightly amusing. "I'm working." "You're always working." "Yes," he said, and went. Elena opened her laptop, sat for a moment, not reading anything. Then she added a note to the table arrangement. "Marco, move him next to Julia's daughter. She'll talk enough for both of them." It was tradition, Julia informed Elena with the authority of someone who was creating a tradition on the spot, for the bride to spend the night before her wedding away from the house. The specifics of this tradition apparently required Eleanor to be at the Lake Forest house in the guest suite, surrounded by Julia and 3 cousins whose names Eleanor was still committing to reliable memory. Matteo had said, when Julia proposed this, that it was not a family tradition. Julia had said, at some length, that it was a tradition now. Matteo had looked at Eleanor. Eleanor had said, "I think it sounds lovely," because she'd spent enough months with this family to know that Julia's organized enthusiasm was both impossible to resist and generally correct in its instincts. So, on the Friday evening, Sal drove her to Lake Forest with a bag for the night, and she sat in the guest suite of Caterina's house with Julia and the 3 cousins, Federica, who was 30 and funny, and her 2 younger sisters, Bianca and Sophia, who were in their 20s and periodically broke into rapid Italian, that Elena was fast enough now to follow approximately 60% of, and they ate things Rosa had sent ahead, and drank a moderate amount of wine and talked about the things that women talk about the night before a wedding. Not strategy, not logistics, the real things. "What's the moment you knew?" Federica asked her, somewhere in the 2nd hour, with the frank curiosity that Elena had come to associate with the Conti women generally. "The actual moment, not the story you tell." Eleanor thought about this honestly because she was good at honest. "The spreadsheet," she said, "in July. He cancelled a morning of meetings to sit in the garden and talk about a financial problem with me. And at some point in the middle of it, I looked up at him and thought, oh, this is just who we are. This is what we do. And it felt like something I'd been doing for years, like coming home to a place I hadn't known I'd lived before. The cousins were quiet for a moment. "That's a very Eleanor answer," Julia said, with affection. "It's a true answer." "The spreadsheet," Bianca said, as if tasting the word. "Our cousin Matteo, who has not brought a woman to this house in 7 years, was won by a spreadsheet." "He was won by the person doing the spreadsheet," Elena said. "The spreadsheet was just the occasion." Federica raised her glass. "2 occasions." They drank. Later, when the cousins had moved to the sitting room and Julia had gone to check on Caterina, Elena sat by the window of the guest suite and looked out at the February dark, the garden bare and still under a clear sky that was so cold it was almost brittle. She could see the shape of the old oak that stood at the garden's edge, its branches exact against the stars. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. "Matteo." "You're supposed to be observing the tradition," she said. "I am," he said. "I'm at the townhouse, observing the tradition from here. That's not what the tradition requires." "The tradition," he said, with the particular dry precision he deployed when Julia had done something he found absurd, "is not actually a tradition." "It is now," Elena said. A pause. She could hear him in the background, the study, probably from the quality of the quiet. "How are you?" "Good," she said. "How are you?" "Strange," he said. "The house is very quiet." She looked at the February stars, something caught in her chest, warm, specific. "Is that bad?" "No," he said slowly. I'm realizing I've become accustomed to it not being quiet, which is—" He stopped. "Which is?" "Good," he said. "It's very good." She smiled at the window. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. The word had the quality of things he decided, complete. They stayed on the phone for a while without talking, which would have been strange before and wasn't now. She listened to the quiet of the townhouse through the phone, and he listened to whatever sounds the Lake Forest house made on a Friday night in February, and neither of them felt the need to fill it, because that was one of the things she'd loved first about him, the inhabited silence. "Good night, Elena," he said, finally. "Good night, Matteo," she said. She went to bed. She slept, which she hadn't entirely expected to, but she was good, when it came to it, at trusting the things she'd decided. The church in Lake Forest was small and old and smelled like beeswax candles and winter cold and old wood, and the February light through the stained glass was thin and golden. And Caterina sat in the front pew in a coat the colour of midnight and her mother's pearl earrings, and wept quietly, with the grace of a woman who had waited for this for a very long time. There were 90 people. Elena had estimated 60. Julia had added 32 without asking, which felt, by now, entirely in keeping with the rhythm of things. Elena stood at the back of the nave in a dress she'd chosen herself, ivory silk, the cut simple, the kind of dress that doesn't announce itself, but that you remember. She had her father on one arm, her father, who had flown in from Tucson and had spent 2 hours talking with Matteo the night before, and had come to dinner red-eyed and called Elena when he got back to the hotel, and said, voice rough, "He told me about your mother, how she would have found it hilarious." And Elena had held the phone and smiled. "Diane?" standing on her other side, was holding her bouquet and trying not to cry, which was a losing battle. "Ready?" Diane said. Elena looked down the aisle where Matteo stood at the front of the church. Dark suit, no tie, because she'd told him no tie, and he'd agreed without argument, which itself was a kind of small miracle. He was facing the altar, but he turned, as if he knew, and found her at the back of the church. Across the 90 people and the beeswax and the thin February gold, they looked at each other. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the coffee shop 7 months ago, direct, full, without the armor. But different now. The coffee shop had been recognition. This was certainty. "Ready," she said. She walked down the aisle of the Lake Forest Church in the thin February light, past cousins and aunts and Marco, who was notably not crying, and Father DiMaggio, who had known the Conti family for 40 years, and toward the man at the front who had met her with a broken umbrella and a contract, and had loved her so carefully and so thoroughly that the line between the arrangement and the real thing had blurred entirely before either of them quite caught the moment. She stood beside him. He took her hand, not for the performance, not for the contract, for the only reason in the end that any of this had ever really been about. "Hi," she said quietly. "Hi," he said. His voice was low and certain, and the grey eyes were warm and completely open. Father DiMaggio cleared his throat gently. They turned to face forward. The vows were the standard ones. Elena had considered writing her own and had decided against it, because she was precise about words, and the standard ones, when you meant them fully, said the thing exactly, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse. She meant all of it. Every clause. She was good at contracts, and this one she was signing with everything she had. Matteo's voice saying them was even and certain in the way of everything he decided. She'd learned by now the difference between his public certainty and his private certainty, and this was private, the quiet register, the stripped-down version of his voice that meant the words were going to the precise place they were intended. When Father DiMaggio said the words that were the hinge of the ceremony, she heard Caterina make a small sound in the front pew. She heard Julia, somewhere behind, exhale something that was almost a word. She felt, in the way you sometimes feel a room shift, the specific warmth of 90 people witnessing something real. He put the ring on her finger, not the sapphire, which she wore on her right hand now. This one was plain gold, simple and permanent, and looked at her, and she thought, the coffee shop, the umbrella, 11 days of savings and the wrong interview and the rain that didn't care about schedules, all of it. The numbers didn't add up until you were in them. She'd said that, in her own mind, in the church. She'd thought it for months. But standing here in the February light, with his hand warm around hers and his grey eyes steady and open, she thought, they did. They added up exactly. They'd been adding up, she understood now, since the moment she hadn't looked back at the corner booth. Almost. The reception dinner at the Lake Forest house went on until nearly midnight, which was 2 hours longer than anyone had planned, and exactly as long as it needed to be. Rosa had outdone herself. Julia had produced, from somewhere, a 3-tiered almond cake that was the cousin of the birthday cake and was consumed entirely before 10 o'clock. The 2 small cousins, the 7- and 11-year-old boys, were still running circuits of the garden at 9 in their good clothes, supervised with weary affection by Marco, who was indeed sitting next to Julia's daughter Federica, and had discovered over the course of the meal that she had opinions about architecture that were almost as strong as her opinions about everything else. Caterina stayed until 11, which the doctors would have called too long. Caterina would have called it appropriate. She sat at the head of the table and drank a small amount of Barolo, and watched her family with the expression of someone who has accomplished something they were not entirely certain they'd live to see, and felt, without question, that they had. Before she left, she called Eleanor to her. "Well," she said, with that small, real smile. "Well," Eleanor said, "how does it feel?" Eleanor thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "Like something I didn't know I was moving toward," she said, "and then arrived at, and it's exactly the shape I'd have chosen if I'd known enough to choose it." Caterina took her hand. "Yes," she said, "that's love, the exact shape you'd have chosen." She looked at Elena's face for a long moment with those clear, ancient eyes that had seen 60 years of this family's particular life. "Take care of him?" "Always," Elena said. "I know." She released her hand. "Now go back to your husband. I'm told he's been watching for you for the last 10 minutes and is pretending he hasn't been." Elena looked across the room. Matteo was in conversation with his Uncle Enzo, which was outwardly indistinguishable from any other conversation he'd had this evening, but she'd learned by now to read the quality of his attention, and she could see, even from here, that half of it was directed toward where she was standing. She caught his eye. His expression did the thing, the calibration, the acknowledgement, and then something warmer, more complete. She went back to him. Later, when the house had quieted and the last cousins had gone, and the kitchen was Rosa's ordered wreckage, and the garden was dark and cold and still, they stood at the window of the sitting room on the second floor, his sitting room, her sitting room, their sitting room, in the order that things had accumulated into permanence, and looked out at the February night. She was leaning against him. His arm was around her. The sapphire on her right hand caught the lamplight when she moved. "Diane cried," he said, after a while. "She promised she wouldn't," Elena said. "Marco didn't." "Marco was working," Elena said, "and also sitting next to Federica, who talked enough for both of them." He made a sound that was the compressed version of a laugh. She'd learned to recognize it, that small exhalation that meant something had genuinely amused him, but that he'd decided not to fully deploy. She loved that sound. She'd never told him because she was saving it. "Your father," he said, "before dinner, he told me—" He stopped. "What did he say?" A pause. "He said she would have liked me. Your mother." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. The February dark was clear and cold beyond the glass, and the old oak in the garden was still and bare and exact. "She would have," she said. "She would have found the whole thing completely hilarious and also the best story she'd heard in years, and she would have made you tell her the umbrella story 4 times until she had it memorized. And then," he said, quietly, "and then she would have looked at you the way she looked at things she'd decided were good," Elena said, which was just, directly, fully, the way she looked at everything she'd decided to keep. His arm tightened slightly around her, not a dramatic gesture, the small, certain kind. "She sounds," he said, "like someone I would have liked. Yes, Elena said. I think you would have. They stood in the warm room, looking at the cold dark, and the silence was the kind that builds rather than the kind that empties, and there was nothing that needed saying, and neither of them said it, and it was exactly enough. The sapphire caught the light. The almond cake was finished. The 90 people had gone home to their own February evenings carrying the specific warmth that comes from witnessing something real. And in the sitting room on the second floor of a townhouse in Lincoln Park that had started as a business arrangement and become, without precise, catalogable moment, a home, 2 people stood at a window and were quiet together, which is one of the most complete things 2 people can be. If you made it all the way here, thank you. Drop a comment and tell us, where are you watching from, and which moment was the one that got you? The storm, the garden, the birthday ring, or the very beginning, when they both reached for a broken umbrella? We read every single comment. If you loved this story, share it with someone who needs a slow burn tonight. See you in the next one.